For 60 years, when the British Army needed a truck, they called one name Thornycroft. Then one day they didn't. In 1864, on the banks of the Thames at Chiswick, John Isaac Thornycroft opened his first engineering works. At just 19, he launched his maiden steam vessel, Nautilus, and set a pattern for invention that would span generations. The Thornycroft name soon became synonymous with technical daring, steam launches and torpedo boats for the Royal Navy, hull designs that pushed speed records, and a string of patents that earned respect across British industry. This was not a backstreet workshop tinkering in obscurity. By the 1870s, Thornycroft's torpedo boats, like HMS Lightning, were setting standards for navies across Europe. Marine engineering was the family's lifeblood, and every detail mattered, from water tube boilers to the shape of a propeller blade. That relentless focus on reliability and performance would leave its mark far beyond the river. By the 1890s, the world was changing. Steam was no longer just for ships, and the roads of Britain beckoned a new kind of machine. Drawing on decades of shipyard experience, Thornycroft began experimenting with steam wagons, vehicles built not for show but for real work, hauling coal, timber and municipal refuse. In 1896, their first self-propelled steam van, with its marine-style boiler and 1-ton capacity, rolled out for the Chiswick Council as a dust cart. It was among the first of its kind on British roads, an industrial leap that carried the Thornycroft reputation from water to land. Behind each innovation stood the same principle. Engineering must serve the nation, whether afloat or on solid ground. The foundations were set, solid, ambitious and unmistakably British. Steam power had carried Thornycroft from the riverbanks of Chiswick onto Britain's earliest motor roads, but the dawn of the 20th century demanded something faster, lighter and more adaptable. By 1902, the company had begun to experiment with petrol engines, reading the signs as internal combustion started to outpace steam in reliability and range. The shift was not just technical, it was strategic. The War Office, still learning the lessons of the Boer War's grueling supply lines, watched with growing interest as Thornycroft's new designs promised to move men and material farther, faster, and with fewer breakdowns. In 1904, the company made a decisive move. Production of road vehicles left behind the cramped yards of Chiswick and settled into a purpose-built factory at Basingstoke. Here, the scale changed. Rows of assembly bays and foundries replaced the riverside sheds, and a new workforce, drawn from the town and surrounding countryside, took up the tools. Petrol-powered trucks rolled out onto the Great Western lines, ready for municipal contracts and, increasingly, for the scrutiny of military evaluators. This was more than an upgrade, it was a statement of intent. Between 1902 and 1907, Thornycroft phased out steam entirely for its lorries, betting everything on petrol. The Basingstoke works became a proving ground for heavy-duty reliability, with vehicles enduring punishing trials and carrying loads that would have stalled lesser machines. By the eve of the First World War, Thornycroft had positioned itself as a manufacturer, capable of meeting mass military orders, ready to answer the call when the nation's demands would soon outstrip anything seen before. In August 1914, as Europe plunged into war, Thornycroft's Basingstoke works became the beating heart of Britain's military logistics. The War Office, now desperate for vehicles that could survive the mud and chaos of the Western Front, placed its faith in the J-type. This was not a gamble. The J-type was a product of relentless engineering, 4-cylinder petrol engine, robust ladder frame, solid rubber tyres and a 2-ton payload. It was built for punishment. Over 5,000 J-types rolled out under government contract during the First World War, a scale few could rival. These lorries formed the backbone of supply lines in France, ferried ammunition and rations across Mesopotamia's deserts, and braved the disease-ridden tracks of East Africa. Wherever the British Army advanced, the J-type followed, hauling, towing, rescuing, enduring. Maps from the time show their spread, from the trenches of Flanders to the banks of the Tigris. Thornycroft lorries became a fixture of the Imperial war machine. Production lines at Basingstoke ran day and night. Factory crews, skilled men and women drafted from the town and countryside, kept the machines moving, their work as vital as any on the front. The War Office's trust was absolute. By standardising on the J-type, the Army signalled that Thornycroft was not just a supplier, but a partner in national survival. This contract was not just a commercial windfall, it was a stamp of industrial capability, proof that Thornycroft's engineering could meet the scale and urgency of a world at war. The J-type's record in the field forged a reputation that would carry the company into peacetime, opening doors to new opportunities and cementing its place in the story of British resilience. Council contracts kept Basingstoke's foundries humming long after the guns fell silent. In the years between wars, Thornycroft's lorries became a familiar sight in British towns, hauling refuse, watering dusty streets and carrying fire crews to emergencies. These municipal commissions were more than bread and butter, they were a laboratory. Every dust cart and fire engine chassis sent out under a council crest carried lessons home to the drawing office. Engineers pored over wear patterns and breakdown logs, refining frames and axles for punishing daily work. The city streets, with their potholes and endless stops, offered a different kind of trial than any battlefield. In 1924, the War Office introduced the A1 subsidy scheme, a government promise to refund part of a truck's cost if it met military standards. Thornycroft's A1 chassis was born from this challenge, built to handle both municipal drudgery and the sudden demands of national mobilisation. The design notebooks from this era reveal a quiet ambition to develop a vehicle strong enough for peacetime utility, yet ready to tow artillery or haul supplies at a moment's notice. Subtle changes in suspension, reinforced cross members and interchangeable bodywork hinted at a dual purpose that was never far from mind. Out of this steady pressure to innovate came a bold new idea, the dedicated heavy tractor. The concept took shape in the interwar years as engineers considered the limits of conventional lorries. Moving tanks, bridges or massive generators would require something more, a true heavy hauler built from the ground up. Early sketches from the late 1920s and the 1930s show the seeds of what would become the Antar, a machine designed not just for weight but for endurance and adaptability. The groundwork was laid for a new kind of logistics, one that would define Thornycroft's role in the conflicts to come. By the late 1930s, the Basingstoke plant was running at a pace few could match. Inside its brick walls, the production lines split and multiplied, each dedicated to a specific need from the front lines or the home front. The Amazon became the company's workhorse, an all-wheel drive lorry built for the unpredictable terrain of war and reconstruction alike. Production records show 1,821 Amazons completed, a figure that speaks to both the demand and the relentless drive of the factory teams. Supervisors kept a close eye on the tally, knowing that every chassis sent out was another link in the supply chain that kept Britain moving. But the Amazon was never just a standard lorry. The most striking innovation was the crane-fitted variant, a collaboration with Coles cranes that transformed the basic truck into a mobile lifting platform. 66 of these specialist units were produced, each one a solution to the problem of moving heavy loads in the field, whether it was bridging equipment, artillery, or vital supplies. The ability to adapt the same basic vehicle to a dozen roles became a Thornycroft hallmark. Line supervisors coordinated teams as the Amazon chassis branched into variants, some fitted for refueling aircraft, others for firefighting, and a handful reinforced for cross-country recovery. Production sheets from Basingstoke read like a catalogue of versatility. Refuse trucks, airfield tenders, and military cranes, they're all sharing the same DNA. The drive for specialisation didn't slow the pace. If anything, it pushed the factory harder. As orders came in from the War Office, civil authorities and overseas buyers, the plant shifted gears seamlessly from one configuration to another. This ability to pivot under pressure to tailor vehicles for any challenge set Thornycroft apart from the mass producers. Adaptability became survival, and for a time, Basingstoke's output seemed limitless. Across the fractured landscapes of the early Cold War, Thornycroft's heavy haulers became the backbone of British military logistics far from home. After the guns of World War II fell silent, new conflicts and commitments demanded a different kind of endurance. the company's legendary heavy tractor, born from decades of engineering for war, now took on a global role, entrusted with the British Army's heaviest burdens. In Korea, the logistical challenge was immense. British Centurion tanks, each tipping the scales at over 50 tons, needed to be moved across battered roads and makeshift bridges. Operational diaries from Royal Army Service Corps units tell of convoys threading their way from Busan to the front. Antars rumbling under their loads, drivers bracing against bitter cold and unpredictable terrain. These were not ceremonial parades. They were relentless, unsung missions, tank transporters crawling through mud, delivering fighting vehicles where they were needed most. The same pattern repeated in the Suez crisis of 1956. As Centurions rolled off landing craft at Port Said, Thornycroft tractors waited, engines idling, ready to haul them inland. Army drivers, many with years behind the wheel, trusted their machines, knowing that a breakdown could stall a whole operation. Through the 1950s and into the heart of the Cold War, Thornycroft's heavy logistics vehicles became a fixture wherever British armour deployed. The company's engineering, tested on every continent, earned a reputation for reliability that few rivals could match. In Germany, Cyprus, Malaya and beyond, the sight of a Centurion tank lashed to a Thornycroft transporter became shorthand for British military presence. The brand's badge, simple and understated, carried weight on every airbase and depot yard. Yet behind the steady rhythm of these global missions, warning signs flickered. The world was changing. Mass production, shifting alliances and the rise of new competitors would soon test even Thornycroft's strongest designs. For now, the company stood at its peak, a trusted workhorse carrying the weight of Britain's commitments on roads far from home. By the late 1950s, the rules of the game had changed. The post-war boom brought new giants to the factory gates: Leyland, Bedford, Ford and AEC, each armed with assembly lines that could churn out thousands of lorries at a cost Thornycroft simply could not match. Mass production slashed the price per truck, turning vehicles once built to order into commodities. For every Antar or Nubian that left Basingstoke, rivals were sending fleets of cheaper, lighter models across Britain and the Commonwealth. The numbers told their own story. While Thornycroft's heavy-duty trucks still carried the Army's faith, the cost per unit was climbing. Family ownership had always been a point of pride, but it came with limits. Raising capital for new machinery or bigger factories meant risking everything on a scale the Thornycrofts had never needed before. Meanwhile, competitors drew on public stock offerings and government incentives, fueling expansions that left smaller firms scrambling to keep up. Inside the boardroom, the choices grew starker: adapt and expand, or risk being outpaced by manufacturers who could deliver twice as many trucks for half the cost. The market no longer rewarded craftsmanship alone. It demanded volume, speed and relentless efficiency. For a company built on specialist engineering, the squeeze was becoming impossible to ignore. Vulnerability crept in, not from any fault in the machines themselves, but from the unforgiving logic of scale. On the 1st of March 1961, the boardroom doors at Basingstoke opened to a new reality. Associated Commercial Vehicles, better known as AEC, completed its acquisition of Thornycroft, ending nearly a century of family-led independence. The deal was not a rescue, but a realignment. Minutes from the merger meetings show the language of consolidation: rationalise production, eliminate duplication, focus on core strengths. For Thornycroft, that meant the loss of autonomy. Decisions once made in Basingstoke now required approval from Southall, where AEC's directors weighed every investment against the needs of a sprawling group. The impact was immediate. Production lines that had built everything from dust carts to heavy cranes were pared back to a handful of specialist models: Antar, Big Ben, Nubian. The engineering office, once free to pursue bold solutions, found its work increasingly bound by group policy. Even the celebrated Thornycroft gearbox, a product of decades of refinement, was rebranded and fitted to AEC, Albion, and Leyland trucks across the empire. What had once been a mark of distinction became a standard part, stripped of its identity. The boardroom portraits remained on the walls, but the company's voice was fading. As the 1960s advanced, Thornycroft's role shrank from innovator to supplier, its name gradually dissolving into the paperwork of a larger machine. The era of independent, family-driven engineering was over, absorbed into a corporate structure where heritage counted for less than efficiency. In 1968, British Leyland swept through the industry, gathering up storied marks in the name of efficiency. For Thornycroft, the transition was neither dramatic nor defiant. A brief corporate memo circulated among managers announced the new order. The Basingstoke works, once alive with the clang of assembly and the pride of generations, fell silent in stages. Production narrowed to a trickle. Only the heavy-haul Antars, a few Big Bens and the Nubian fire tenders, machines built to serve but now outnumbered by cheaper, mass-produced rivals. By 1977, the Thornycroft name was retired. No grand send-off, no final parade. The last Nubian rolled off the line, its badge quietly removed from the order books. For the men and women of Basingstoke, the end came not with a bang, but with the slow closing of factory gates. Some found work at Leyland or Scammell, others scattered, leaving behind a legacy that would not be recorded in headlines. Decades of service, 2 world wars and the backbone of Britain's military logistics, all consigned to memory as the brand was quietly erased. The silence that followed was as telling as any tribute, a quiet farewell to a name that had carried the weight of a nation. In an age obsessed with legacy, the silence around Thornycroft's disappearance is striking. Industrial giants that once shaped national destiny can be erased with barely a footnote. Today, Britain's roads and battlefields bear no trace of the name that helped secure them. If memory is the final reward for service, Thornycroft deserved more. Tell us, did you ever see one in the wild? Subscribe and share your memories below.